The first phase of an avoidance collapse begins quietly. From the outside, it may look like indifference. They'll act composed, logical, maybe even relieved. But inside, their nervous system is unraveling in slow motion. Avoidants survive on control, and control has always been their safety mechanism. They regulate through distance, through predictability, through emotional detachment. But when they lose the person who provided real emotional grounding, someone who loved them without needing to chase, someone who stopped reacting to their inconsistency, they lose the structure that kept their avoidance intact. And when the mind that depends on control suddenly realizes it can't control anymore, it doesn't heal, it fragments. At first, they cling to denial. It's fine, they tell themselves. This is better for both of us. They rely on logic because logic is their favorite hiding place. It gives them a sense of power when emotion feels too heavy. They'll fill their time with noise, work, hobbies, distractions, anything that keeps their attention away from what's happening underneath. They'll even convince themselves that you were the problem, that you expected too much, that you misunderstood them. But this isn't truth, it's defense. The mind builds stories to protect the heart from chaos. It's easier to rewrite the past than to sit in the discomfort of loss. But slowly, the cracks begin to show. At night, in silence, their thoughts get loud. They start scrolling through old conversations. They linger on your name, your last words, your calm tone when you finally stopped explaining yourself. The calmness unsettles them. Because they're used to conflict, they're used to emotional reactions they can manage or retreat from. Your peace becomes the mirror of their chaos. It reminds them of something they never learned to do: stay present with discomfort. This stage is where their internal war begins. One part of them misses you deeply, even desperately. The other part is terrified of what that means. Missing you feels like vulnerability. Vulnerability feels like danger. So they oscillate, between wanting to reach out and wanting to disappear, between wanting to feel and wanting to forget, between nostalgia and numbness. And every swing between those extremes is a quiet form of collapse. They'll tell friends they're fine. They'll post like life is normal. They'll even flirt or date as if they've already moved on. But these are coping mechanisms, not healing. The body is still holding grief, the mind is still spinning stories, and the heart is still avoiding the very thing it needs to face: accountability. Because to heal, they'd have to admit they lost something, because of their own patterns. And accountability is kryptonite to someone whose entire identity is built on self-protection. Avoidants fall apart differently from everyone else. They don't explode outwardly, they implode inwardly. They don't cry loudly, they crumble silently. Their collapse looks like detachment turning into emptiness. It looks like losing interest in things that once felt meaningful. It looks like restless nights and overthinking during the day. It looks like short bursts of motivation followed by waves of fatigue. They start feeling the cost of all the emotional walls they built, the cost of never letting anyone in deep enough to stay. And yet, beneath the pain, something starts shifting. They begin to realize that their avoidance wasn't strength. It was fear disguised as independence. They start to see that love didn't suffocate them, their fear of love did. That you weren't controlling, you were consistent. That the emotional intensity they ran from was actually connection trying to reach them. It's a brutal awakening because they now understand what they lost, but too late to undo it. In this stage, some avoidants try to reestablish contact. Not because they're ready to change, but because they can't stand the silence anymore. Silence used to give them power, now it gives them anxiety. They'll test the waters with a small message, pretending it's casual. But underneath, there's panic. Panic that you've truly moved on. Panic that they no longer have emotional influence. Panic that their avoidance finally cost them something real. When you don't respond the way you used to, when you remain calm and unbothered, it triggers the deepest fear in them, not rejection, but irrelevance. For an avoidant, being irrelevant means losing emotional control completely, and that's when the fall apart becomes full collapse. The sadness hits. The anger follows. The regret surfaces. They start remembering moments they dismissed, love they minimized, chances they wasted. The facade of indifference dissolves into quiet remorse. This isn't healing yet. Healing requires openness, consistency, and vulnerability, all the things they've avoided for years. What they experience here is exposure. The mask is off. The silence is loud, the control is gone, and what's left is the raw truth of their own fear. That's the real collapse, the moment they realize avoidance didn't protect them from pain, it only delayed it. Because the loss they were trying to avoid has already happened. And this time, there's no one left to save them from themselves. In the second phase, the avoidant doesn't fall apart in a way that looks like grief. They fall apart in a way that looks like movement. They stay busy, they stay loud, they stay stimulated, because stillness is where the loss becomes real. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the stage where they don't heal, they self-medicate with distraction. Work becomes a drug. Social plans become a drug. New hobbies become a drug. Attention from strangers becomes a drug. Anything that keeps them from sitting in the quiet, because the quiet is where their nervous system starts whispering the truth they've been denying. At first, they can appear almost energized. They might post more, go out more, laugh more, look fine. But that fine is often a performance built on adrenaline and control. Their attachment system is designed to reduce emotional intensity, so the breakup feels like a release valve. They interpret relief as certainty. See, I'm okay. They tell themselves, I needed this. But relief isn't proof the relationship was wrong. Relief is just what happens when pressure stops. It's the body exhaling after running from closeness. And because the avoidant mistakes that exhale for healing, they skip the work of processing and jump straight into proving they're unaffected. This is where they start rewriting the story. They focus on your reactions instead of their triggers. They magnify your needs and minimize your pain. They remember the hardest moments and forget the tenderness. Not because they're evil, but because remembering the tenderness would crack the armor. If they admit you were steady, they have to admit they were inconsistent. If they admit you love them deeply, they have to admit they couldn't receive it without panicking. And that admission creates shame. So the mind protects itself by editing the past. They were too emotional. It wasn't that deep. We weren't compatible. I had to protect my peace. The narrative becomes a shield against accountability. But the body doesn't follow the narrative. The body follows attachment. The body remembers what the mind tries to erase. So while they're busy convincing themselves they've moved on, their nervous system starts leaking truth in small, ugly ways. They feel restless for no reason. They get irritated easily. They can't focus. They can't sleep. They feel a strange emptiness after social events end. They feel hollow when they come home and no one is there to witness them. They're surrounded by people, yet something still feels missing, and that missing isn't just you. It's the emotional anchor you represented. This is also the phase where rebounds and quick connections can appear. Not always, but often. A rebound is not always about replacing you. It's about outrunning the feeling of being exposed. New attention is simple. New attention is light. New attention doesn't demand repair. New attention doesn't look at them and say, why do you disappear when things get real? New attention gives dopamine without accountability, and dopamine can numb grief for a while. It can create the illusion of being over it, but the illusion fades because the pain wasn't solved, it was postponed. During this stage, the avoidance pride fights their longing. They may check your profile, then tell themselves they don't care. They may reread messages, then feel embarrassed for even looking. They may miss you at night, then act cold in the morning. This push-pull isn't a game as much as it is a nervous system conflict. One side wants comfort. The other side fears dependence. One side misses the safety you gave. The other side resents the vulnerability that safety awakens. So they swing between distraction and collapse, and each swing drains them more. This is where the fall apart becomes visible if you know what to look for. It's not tears, it's dysregulation. They might become impulsive. They might start making decisions that don't even match their values. They might chase novelty harder than usual because novelty keeps feelings at bay. They might become colder, not because they stopped caring, but because caring is starting to break through and they're trying to freeze it back down. When someone has built their identity around being unaffected, feeling is humiliating. So they turn the volume up on everything else to drown it out. And this is the cruelest part, they can still believe they're fine. While they're unraveling, they confuse emotional numbness with strength. They confuse independence with healing. They confuse being busy with being free. But healing requires one thing they've avoided their whole life: emotional presence. Presence with discomfort. Presence with regret. Presence with the truth. And because they can't do that yet, the grief doesn't flow through them, it sits inside them like pressure building behind a wall. Eventually, the distractions stop hitting the same. The nights get quieter. The weekends get heavier. The quick validation feels empty, and the avoidant starts realizing that what they called peace was just distance. And distance doesn't comfort you forever. It only delays the moment you have to face what you lost and what you did to lose it. When the avoidant reaches the third stage of this collapse, distraction stops working. The job that used to keep them busy no longer fills the void. The new people they surrounded themselves with start feeling hollow. The energy that once came from denial begins to fade. And for the first time, they start feeling the full emotional weight of the loss they thought they had escaped. This is not a clean grief, it's messy, delayed, and disorienting. Avoidants don't feel loss all at once. Their bodies hold it in until it leaks through cracks in their control, showing up as anxiety, irritability, insomnia, or moments of unexpected sadness that hit without warning. The first cracks usually come in quiet moments. They might wake up in the middle of the night and reach for their phone out of habit, only to remember you're not there anymore. They scroll through old messages, not to reconnect, but to confirm the past was real. Their mind starts replaying small moments, your tone, your laugh, the way you said their name when they were shutting down. They once dismissed those things as ordinary, but now they realize those were the pieces that made them feel safe. They didn't know it at the time, because safety was foreign to them. They mistake peace for boredom, closeness for pressure, affection for loss of control. Now, without it, their nervous system feels exposed. The silence that once gave them relief becomes suffocating. This is where reality catches up with their illusions. They start noticing how other connections feel shallow in comparison. The casual dates, the late night distractions, the temporary highs, none of it fills the space you occupied. You were not just a partner, you were the mirror that reflected the parts of them they never learned to face. When you left, you didn't just take love with you, you took regulation. Your presence used to calm their chaos, even if they never thanked you for it. You were the grounding energy that balanced their avoidance. Without that, their mind begins spiraling in ways they can't control. They might try to fix the pain the same way they avoided it, by seeking control again. Maybe they try to reach out, not to apologize, but to test the waters. They send a short message or react to something you posted, pretending it's casual. But under that small action is a desperate need for reassurance. Am I still in your mind? Do I still matter? If you respond warmly, they feel immediate relief. But as soon as the closeness returns, the fear floods back in. They go silent again, thinking, I can't handle this. It's not a conscious game, it's a trauma reflex. They want connection, but can't tolerate the vulnerability that connection requires. And when you no longer play along, when you don't chase or over-explain, they realize the dynamic has changed permanently. This realization is the breaking point. For most of their life, they believed that control equaled power. They believed that as long as they could stay emotionally detached, they'd never be hurt. But losing someone who loved them through their detachment destroys that illusion. It shows them that control doesn't prevent pain, it guarantees it. It doesn't make love safer, it makes it impossible. That's why this stage feels like internal collapse. They can't run anymore, because there's nowhere left to go that doesn't remind them of what they've lost. Avoidants rarely admit how deep this collapse runs. To others, they might still appear strong, even composed. But inside, they're unraveling in quiet ways. They find themselves zoning out in conversations. Their appetite shifts, their focus drops. They can't fully engage in the present because their mind keeps looping back to what they avoided. The body keeps score, and theirs is finally cashing in the debt of years spent outrunning emotions. For some, this stage becomes the start of awakening. The pain forces reflection. They start reading about attachment, replaying memories, trying to understand what went wrong. They begin to see patterns, how their silence hurt you, how their withdrawal confused you, how their coldness was never strength but fear. But for others, this stage becomes the deep end of avoidance. The shame feels unbearable, so they run again. They seek new control, new distractions, new people, anything that allows them to postpone feeling. But the more they run, the emptier it gets. Because you can't outrun what's inside you, and the truth always catches up. By this point, the avoidant isn't fighting you anymore, they're fighting themselves. They start realizing that healing isn't about finding someone new, it's about learning how to stop hiding. But few are ready for that. Most keep circling the same pain, mistaking collapse for closure. And yet, in those rare moments when the noise fades and they're left alone with their thoughts, they feel it, the ache of losing something they didn't know how to keep, the kind of love that asked for presence, not perfection, and the haunting awareness that avoidance didn't protect them at all. It only taught them how to be alone in rooms full of people, chasing control while craving connection. The fourth phase of an avoidance collapse is where the illusion of stability completely breaks and their defenses start turning against them. Up to this point, they've relied on denial, distraction, and control to manage their pain, convincing themselves that they were fine, that they didn't care, that moving on was easy. But when all those temporary numbing mechanisms wear off, reality hits them like a quiet, unstoppable wave. This stage is not just emotional, it's physiological. Their body begins to react to the emotional stress they've suppressed for months. Sleep becomes erratic, focus disappears, appetite shifts, and small things start triggering massive waves of unease. What they told themselves was peace now feels like emptiness. What they called freedom now feels like disconnection. And that's when the mind begins to crumble under the weight of its own avoidance. Avoidants are trained by experience to equate closeness with danger, but they also equate avoidance with safety. That false sense of safety starts to disintegrate here. Their once calm detachment turns into restlessness. Their independence begins to feel like isolation. The same silence they used as a weapon against you becomes the very thing that punishes them. When you were present, your warmth absorbed their coldness. Your steadiness gave their distance meaning. But now that you're gone, the silence they thought they wanted becomes a mirror they can't escape. It reflects back everything they tried not to see: their patterns, their fear, their inability to let love in without pushing it away. This is when the regret begins to surface in painful waves. They start remembering the moments they dismissed as unimportant, the way you used to speak softly when they were distant, the way you offered love without demanding, the way you kept choosing them even when they made it hard. These memories don't feel comforting, they feel haunting. Each one reminds them of what they took for granted. They begin to understand that what they lost wasn't just a relationship, it was the person who accepted them despite their avoidance. And that kind of love doesn't return often. They know it now, but it's too late to repair the damage without real change. At this stage, some avoidants try to reassert control by attempting contact. But it's different from the earlier, manipulative phases. It's no longer about ego, it's about desperation. They want to know if the door is still open, if they still matter, if redemption is possible. But they don't know how to communicate that honestly, so they default to half efforts. A casual message, a vague question, something that lets them test your temperature without fully exposing themselves. It's not that they don't care, it's that they don't trust themselves to stay once they re-enter. Vulnerability still terrifies them, so they dance on the edge of sincerity, unable to take the full leap into accountability. When their small efforts don't yield the emotional reassurance they're craving, the collapse deepens. Anger may appear, not at you, but at themselves. They become frustrated with how hard it is to move on, with how much energy it takes to pretend they're fine. They start resenting the emotional dependency they once denied having. Their pride clashes with their grief. On one hand, they want to reach out and fix things. On the other, they can't bear the humiliation of needing the very thing they rejected. This internal war is exhausting, and for many avoidants, it leads to a kind of quiet breakdown, a loss of motivation, a depressive fog, an emptiness that feels endless. The irony is that this pain is the doorway to real healing, but only if they can stop running from it. The problem is, avoidance is so ingrained that even their suffering becomes something they try to control. They'll intellectualize it. They'll say things like, "It just wasn't meant to be," or "I guess love isn't for me," or "People always leave." These phrases sound wise, but they're really a form of surrender to fear. They'd rather believe love is impossible than admit they destroyed something good because they didn't know how to receive it. If the avoidant ever decides to face the truth in this phase, the process is excruciating. It means sitting in the discomfort of what they've done. It means accepting that love requires effort, vulnerability, and humility. It means realizing that control never protected them, it only postponed heartbreak. But for many, this realization comes too late. By the time they understand that emotional safety was possible with you, you've already rebuilt your peace, reclaimed your power, and closed the door they once left half open. The collapse isn't about losing the relationship, it's about losing the illusion of invulnerability. They finally see that the walls they built to stay safe kept them lonely. That every time they avoided pain, they also avoided joy. That every time they ran from connection, they ran from healing. And once that awareness sets in, there's no escape from it. That's why avoidants don't truly heal. After this kind of loss, they unravel until they face themselves. Because until they stop using distance as armor, every new connection will remind them of the one they broke. Not because they weren't loved, but because they didn't know how to love back. The fifth phase of an avoidance emotional collapse is where the mask finally breaks and the pain they've been repressing becomes undeniable. This isn't the tidy kind of sadness that comes with reflection or maturity. It's messy, unpredictable, and often disguised as something else. The avoidant doesn't immediately recognize it as grief, they experience it as anxiety, restlessness, emptiness, or even physical exhaustion. For so long, they've relied on control as a coping mechanism, but now that control is gone. They can't outrun the silence anymore. Every distraction they used to escape the truth, work, socializing, temporary validation, starts losing its power. The world feels quieter, and in that quiet, their regrets start to echo louder than anything else. This stage often begins with confusion. They wonder why they're suddenly sad when they chose the distance, why they can't focus even though they should be fine. Why they feel a deep ache every time they think about you, even though they told themselves they didn't need you. That confusion is the collapse of cognitive dissonance, the gap between their logic and their emotion. Avoidants live most of their lives through logic because logic feels safe. It gives them an illusion of control over unpredictable emotions. But grief doesn't obey logic. It shows up without permission and it demands to be felt. And for the avoidant, who has spent a lifetime avoiding feelings, this stage is unbearable. They start remembering not just the moments you shared, but the moments they destroyed. The conversations they shut down, the affection they pushed away, the apologies they never gave. The images come like flashes, you sitting quietly, waiting for them to open up, you walking away, finally exhausted, your calm voice when you said you couldn't do it anymore. In earlier stages, they could rewrite these memories to make themselves the victim. But now, those distortions no longer hold. The truth pierces through. They weren't protecting themselves from pain, they were creating it. This realization doesn't make them instantly empathetic or ready for growth. In fact, it often makes them spiral. The shame becomes overwhelming. Shame is different from guilt. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. And for someone who has spent their whole life trying to appear self-sufficient, shame feels like exposure. So they retreat again. But this time, the retreat doesn't bring relief. The silence that once regulated them now feels like suffocation. The avoidance that once brought safety now feels like punishment. In this phase, many avoidants begin to experience emotional flashbacks, moments when their unresolved childhood fears surface. They might not understand it consciously, but their body remembers what it felt like to be rejected, unseen, or unloved. Losing you reactivates those old wounds. It's not just about you. It's about every time in their life they felt unsafe in connection. They begin to associate your absence not just with loss, but with the collapse of the identity they built around emotional control. Their independence starts to feel like abandonment. Their solitude, once a point of pride, becomes unbearable. Some avoidants try to regain balance by reaching out again, not from manipulation this time, but from genuine emotional panic. They might not say, I'm sorry, or I miss you, directly, because that would mean vulnerability. Instead, they might ask neutral questions, bring up random topics, or send nostalgic messages, hoping you'll open the door for them. If you don't, they may spiral deeper into self-blame. They start questioning their choices, why they pulled away, why they didn't fight for you, why they thought detachment was strength. That's when the truth finally sinks in. Their fear of being hurt made them become the one who hurts. In this stage, emotional exhaustion takes over. The avoidant becomes quieter, more withdrawn, but not because they've regained composure, because they're out of energy. The mental effort to suppress emotions fails, and the weight of everything they've been avoiding becomes too heavy to carry. They may start overanalyzing every word, every silence, every moment of the relationship, searching for a way they could have done it differently. But analysis doesn't bring peace, it only deepens the pain. Healing requires vulnerability, and that's the one thing they still can't fully do. For some, this stage becomes the first real step toward growth. They might finally begin therapy, journal for the first time, or start facing the fear they've avoided all their life. They begin to understand that emotional detachment wasn't freedom, it was fear wearing armor. For others, though, this phase becomes the beginning of repetition. Instead of facing the pain, they find someone new to distract them again, creating another cycle of connection, withdrawal, and loss. The difference this time is that the cracks are visible. Their old methods don't work the same. The numbness doesn't last as long. The emptiness arrives faster. Because once you've lost something real, no amount of avoidance can make that truth disappear. By the end of this phase, the avoidant doesn't just grieve the relationship, they grieve the version of themselves that destroyed it. They start to see that the walls they built to protect their heart also became their prison. And as much as they wish they could go back and change things, they realize they can't. They can only sit in the wreckage and decide whether to build something new from it or bury themselves in the ruins. And that's the painful truth about avoidance. It doesn't protect you from heartbreak, it guarantees it. Because when love finally reaches for you and you flinch away, the person who ends up unhealed isn't the one who left. It's the one who stayed hiding behind their fear, mistaking control for safety, until all that's left is loneliness masquerading as strength. In the final stage of an avoidance emotional collapse, there comes a moment that looks calm on the surface, but is actually the deepest kind of chaos inside. This is where avoidance reaches its limit. The strategies that once worked, the silence, the distraction, the intellectualizing, the emotional distance, all stop providing relief. The walls that used to protect them now feel like barriers keeping them trapped with their own pain. They don't just feel lonely anymore, they feel haunted. Haunted by memories, by realizations, by the quiet understanding that they pushed away something real and can't get it back. At first, this stage looks like withdrawal. They may stop reaching out to anyone, isolate more, or suddenly disappear from social spaces. But this isn't the peaceful solitude they used to crave, it's isolation born from exhaustion. Their mind has been fighting itself for months, maybe years, trying to balance the story that they were fine with the truth that they're not. And now, they're too tired to keep pretending. The detachment that once felt empowering starts to feel like a slow emotional death. They might look calm, but their internal world is shaking, because for the first time, there's no escape from the consequences of their avoidance. In this phase, deep reflection begins, not because they want to, but because they have no choice. Pain forces introspection. They start asking questions they never dared to ask before. Why do I always destroy good things? Why do I run from people who care about me? Why do I push away what I secretly want? These questions aren't rhetorical anymore. They're desperate attempts to understand the pain that won't stop. The avoidant finally realizes that the common denominator in every emotional collapse isn't the other person, it's them. And that truth hurts more than any breakup ever could. What happens next depends entirely on whether they can sit with that pain long enough to learn from it. Some can't. For them, this stage turns into a slow descent into numbness. They start living on autopilot, functioning at work, smiling when needed, but emotionally hollow inside. They become experts at pretending they're okay while quietly disassociating from anything that might make them feel again. They don't heal, they just survive. But survival isn't living. It's a loop of avoidance that repeats until something finally forces change, a new heartbreak, a crisis, a moment where they realize they can't keep living this way. For others, this collapse becomes the breaking point that leads to awakening. They begin to understand that control never protected them, it only isolated them. That vulnerability isn't weakness, it's connection. They realize that love was never the danger, fear was. The truth is, avoidants don't actually fear love itself. They fear the parts of themselves that love exposes: need, dependence, softness, trust. In this final stage, if they allow themselves to feel without running, something miraculous begins to happen. The pain that once felt unbearable becomes a teacher. They begin to see patterns. They start remembering moments in childhood where they learned to equate emotion with rejection or punishment. They begin to connect the dots between their past and their present. And that awareness, as painful as it is the first real sign of healing. The avoidant who chooses growth starts doing something they've never done before. They begin to reach for help, maybe not from the person they lost, but from someone safe enough to listen. They start opening up, even awkwardly. They begin journaling, or seeking therapy, or sitting in silence without turning it into self-punishment. They start rebuilding their identity from the inside out, piece by piece. For the first time, they start learning how to stay when things get hard instead of running. It's not a fast transformation, it's slow, uncomfortable, and often full of relapses. But every time they choose honesty over control, they heal a part of themselves that's been broken for years. And yet, even this awakening is bittersweet, because they can't escape the realization that they had to lose something irreplaceable to reach it. They remember your patience, your presence, your willingness to love them even when they made it impossible. They know now that what they thought was control was actually fear disguised as strength. They understand that your detachment wasn't cruelty, it was self-respect. And that realization cuts deep because they finally see what you were trying to teach them all along. Love is not about power, it's about presence. By the time they reach this understanding, the relationship is usually gone, and they have to grieve not just you, but the version of themselves they could have become if they had faced their fear sooner. It's a painful maturity, one born not from insight, but from loss. The avoidant finally understands that emotional safety doesn't come from running away from connection, it comes from creating it. And if they ever rebuild, they'll do it differently. They'll listen more, stay longer, communicate instead of disappear. But that version of them is built on the ashes of everything they once destroyed. And that's why avoidants don't truly heal. After this kind of loss, they transform through it. Healing implies return to normal, but there's no going back. This kind of loss rewires them. It forces them to see that what they called freedom was just fear in disguise, and that love, real love, requires surrender. The only question that remains is whether they'll use that pain to grow, or bury it and repeat the cycle again. Because once an avoidant has fallen apart this deeply, there's only two paths left: rebuild with truth, or live forever behind walls that no longer protect, only imprison.